everyone! We're continuing our series on Peter. Last week we discovered how Peter, formerly known as Simon, was faced with choices that required him to have great faith in Jesus. Today we're going to look at how Peter's faith began to waver during a scary situation. Our story takes place after Jesus fed 5,000 people. Immediately after this amazing event, Jesus made the disciples get into a boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of the lake. Now, meanwhile, Jesus spent this time by himself to pray. During the early hours of the morning, Jesus decides to join the disciples on the boat. He does this by defying the powers of the elements and walks on the lake water. Matthew chapter 14, verse 26 says, "When the disciples saw him on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear." Now, can you imagine being on that boat with the disciples? Imagine waking up, looking across the lake, and you see this being walking on the water towards your boat. I'm not sure about you, but I would be pretty freaked out. Now, Jesus immediately responds, telling the disciples, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Peter's response to Jesus is doubtful. We see in verse 28, Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, if it's you," he replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Now, basically, Peter is saying, well, if it's really you, then command me to come to you by walking on the water. Jesus responds by saying one single word, "Come." Now, have you ever been on a boat before? My dad is an avid fisherman, so I grew up fishing on many lakes. When you're in the middle of a lake, it's often very, very deep. And if you swim like me, like a rock, you don't dare stand on the edge of the boat in case you fall in. So here we have Peter standing on the edge of the boat, knowing very well that that water is very deep. Imagine you're on a boat and you put one leg over the edge and your foot goes down towards the surface of that water. Now, if that was me, knowing again that I swim like a rock, I will confess I would be totally nervous about plunging into the deep lake waters. But we see in our story that Peter has great faith in Jesus. In fact, his faith is so big that he began to walk confidently towards Jesus. But this is the part of our story where things change. You see, the wind started to pick up. And when the wind blows across a lake, it causes the waves to grow bigger, sometimes causing whitecaps on the top of the waves. Now, imagine trying to walk across a lake with strong winds and whitecaps crashing against your feet. Let's see how Peter responds to the wind. Verse 30 says, "But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, 'Lord, save me.' Jesus immediately goes to Peter, extends his arm to him to pull him up from the waters. Then Jesus responds, 'You of little faith, why did you doubt?' When Jesus and Peter arrived at the boat, they climbed in and the wind died down. Those who were in the boat began to worship Jesus, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Now, let's pause here just for a moment. Here we have a handful of disciples who left the comfort of their homes, their family, their jobs, and after witnessing yet another miracle, they are telling Jesus that he is truly the Son of God. In fact, verse 32 is the very first time we see the disciples referring to Jesus as the Son of God. Now, before this point, the disciples were not quite certain if Jesus was truly the Son of God. They may have thought he was simply a healer or a prophet, but as they continued to hang out with Jesus, their faith slowly increased, and they came to realize that Jesus is God's Son. You see, Jesus has authority over many things. He can command the wind, defy the elements, and heal the sick. We just need to have faith in him. Now, if you're like me, I totally relate to Peter. Some days, usually when things are running smooth in my life, I'm like, God is so good. I've got great faith in him. But there are days when things can get tough. Life can get hard and scary. And that's when my faith in God might start to waver like Peter. And that's the exact same time when the enemy may try to influence me, attempting to shatter my faith in God. I might find myself fearful, like Peter, and start to sink. But just remember this: when you find yourself sinking in a scary situation and those scary waters, just call out to Jesus. It's okay to ask him to save you. Jesus wants us to go to him, to lean on him, to lift our arms up to him so he can lift us out of those challenging situations. Jesus wants us to have great courage during our storms, and we can find that courage in him. Now, we've reached the end of our story, but I want to encourage you and your family to read the whole story together by clicking on the scripture link below. You'll also find a discussion and activity sheet below to complete with your family. I hope you all have a blessed week. I'll see you guys next week.